Good afternoon. My name is Marguerite Griffin. I'm the Director of Philanthropic Services at Northern Trust, and I want to thank you and welcome you to the 24th edition of Expo Chicago. Northern is honored to once again serve as the presenting sponsor for Expo, and on behalf of Northern Trust, I want to just invite you and welcome you to this discussion, which will be building a Chicago-based collection. And this is presented in partnership with Freeman Heinemann. The conversation will focus on Black cultural production and institution building in Chicago, addressing the rich history of support that exists between artists, their patrons, and the lesser-known cultural producers that have helped shape the city. Additionally, the audience will get a look at a robust and prestigious collection created through relationships with Chicago artists like Richard Hunt, Theaster Gates, Kerry James Marshall, Amanda Williams, Shani Crowe, and Dawoud Bey. And today, I am also pleased to introduce our esteemed panelists. Dr. Anita Blanchard is an art collector. She's a retired professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Chicago and the former Associate Dean of Graduate Medical Education at the Pritzker School of Medicine. During her 31 years in medicine, she has enhanced Chicago's South Side community by increasing the diversity of physicians and building programs to fulfill community needs. She served on many corporate and professional boards and currently serves on the Board of Trustees for the Art Institute of Chicago, Studio Museum in Harlem, the Richard Hunt Legacy Foundation, and her history of civic engagement includes the Committee for the Preservation of the White House, the Renaissance Society, the Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, and the Chicago Landmarks Commission. Yesomi Umolu is an arts leader and an independent curator. She recently served as Director of Curatorial Affairs and Public Service at Serpentine in London. And in that role, she co-organized Serpentine Pavilion 2022, Black Chapel by Theaster Gates, and Barbara Chase Ribot, Infinite Folds, the first survey of this artist in Europe. Yesomi was previously director and curator for the Logan Center exhibitions at the University of Chicago, where she also taught visual arts courses and spatial practices as a lecturer in the humanities division. Yesomi has served as reviewer and juror for major artist residencies and granting organizations, including Artadia, Core Residency Program, Creative Capital, and the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage. She holds an MA with distinction from the Royal College of Art in London and an MA with honors from the University of Edinburgh. Northern Trust is thrilled to be partnering with the Serpentine later this year as a sponsor of their highly anticipated Lauren Haley exhibition, which will run from October 4th through January 5th, 2025. And before I turn the microphone over to Yesomi and Anita, I want to mention that today's program will be video recorded for archival and possible future promotions. However, the audience questions and your engagement will not be videotaped. Thank you, and please welcome Yesomi and Anita.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's so great to see you all. I'm back in Chicago. I think it's been less than 24 hours, but I already feel very much at home, and it's really lovely to see in the audience some great friends and basically a family which I was able to kind of join in Chicago, having spent about 5.5 years here. So I feel very touched to have you all join us, and I'm even more touched to be in conversation with Anita, who is not only a wonderful supporter and patron of the arts, but I think a really great friend to many people in this room, and has been a great friend to myself and my family while we were in Chicago, but also since we left Chicago as well. So it's nice to return. And so a couple of months ago, when the Expo team, we were chatting in London, and they were talking about whether or not I'd been to Chicago recently. I said, no, I haven't, but I would love to come back. And they said, would love to have you have a conversation and do something at Expo. What would you like to do? And I was, I would love to be in conversation with Anita. And after a couple of weeks of thinking about it, and then I sent her a text, and she was so generous to say, okay, I'll do it. So I'm very, very pleased to be here. This really is about Anita's collection, but also her approach to kind of collecting and supporting artists in the city. And I think it's a very unique approach, and I think she has done this work in a very kind of humble and quiet manner, but its resonance kind of stretches far and wide, especially as we see the artists that she's worked with represented in collections all the world over, but also doing major projects and biennials. So I thought we would just kind of try and delve into kind of her motivations behind collecting and how she's kept that commitment over the years, and also what's exciting her today, and what she hopes for the future in terms of her collecting practice, but I think also hopefully thinking about stewardship of artistic practices in the city of Chicago moving forward. So my first question is actually about the set of images that we're seeing up, a series of portraits by the very renowned photographer Dawoud Bey, who we're all with this morning at breakfast. And this was one of the first pieces that Anita showed me when I visited her house, having just kind of arrived in Chicago for a couple of months. So Anita, I thought we'd start here. Could you tell us the story behind these images?
Well, first I want to thank everyone for coming. I am just overwhelmed with the number of friends and family and loved ones, and I think that's what really makes Chicago special. It's such a great art community with artists and supporters and friends, and we all were together this morning for breakfast, so it just really feels like an organic, natural experience. Dawoud Bey, who's a great friend, actually Marty and I met him in 1997. He did a collaboration, and Eric is shaking his head because you were one of the folks who were there too, having your photo taken. He did it in conjunction with Rona Hoffman and Madeline Rabb. And so everyone who knows me knows I have 5 kids, so you know that this is a very dated photo because we only have 2. But he had this large format camera, and it was a fascinating process. He took a picture and just peeled back the negative, and there was the image. And it was really the start of a really beautiful friendship. Dawoud and Candida at the time lived in New York with their son Ramon, but about 6 months later, they moved to Chicago. And I really think that's what I love about it. I never really thought of myself as a collector, because it was really more about the relationships with the artists more than the objects. And I think Dawoud is a perfect example of someone who I've learned so much from him about art, but also he's had a wonderful career, and through our friendship, we've also met and built a community with other artists and curators. So thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me here.
Amazing. So I think it would be good to hear a little bit more about, from these images, how you built that relationship with Dawoud.
Absolutely.
Was that studio visits? Was that going to exhibitions? Like, how did the kind of interest in his practice sort of germinate over the years? And I guess this sort of exemplifies, I think, your approach to collecting, which is the relationship with the artist, right? Which presupposes potentially the object, or a different type of relationship to them. And I just wanted, maybe you could talk a little bit why you think, or why specifically having a relationship with artists has been important to you in your trajectory.
So one thing I think about art is you can experience it in a lot of different ways. And as a woman who grew up on the south side of Chicago, I didn't really frequent museums when I was a child, and I really didn't feel comfortable walking to galleries to get to know and learn about art. But luckily, Madeline Rabb would have these salons in which she would invite young professionals to her home to meet artists. And the very first artist we bought and met was Betty Czar. So it was amazing. I spent 2 months' salary as a resident on a tiny piece that still hangs in my living room today. So meeting Dawoud was really important because it was a very personal connection. So I connected to him as much as I connected to the work. And so Candida, his then wife, we would drop our kids off at lab school, and then I would go to her studio for visits. So it was a really natural and easy way of experiencing art on a personal level. And then from there, I would go to some of his shows, and I remember going to Birmingham Museum of Art, where he did a Birmingham project that was the 50th year anniversary of the bombing of the Birmingham church and the 4 little girls. And he took photographs of women who were the age that those women would have been, and girls at the time when they were killed. And what struck me so much is that many of the people who were the subjects came into that museum for the very first time and took pictures of themselves in front of their photos. And I felt very much that was my exposure to art too. I didn't necessarily go to a museum or walk into a studio. I met an artist, made the connection with them, and that was what made me feel comfortable walking into those other spaces.
That's such a beautiful kind of rendition of your introduction into Dawoud's practice, but also into museum going, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think for us who love the arts, we all remember our first connection to museums, and it comes through different avenues, and just kind of exemplifying how through relationships, which was really how I got into the arts as well, was not necessarily interested in the artwork itself, but it was interested in kind of the relationships and the social spaces that existed around art practice. And I know that you're very, very adept at kind of bringing artists together, especially in your home, and kind of hosting artists in different ways. Could you talk about that? What that means to kind of convene artists and to kind of encourage conversation and dialogue between artists?
Well, for me, I was an OBGYN for 31 years, and I always felt like my career was a very concrete one. I loved what I did, and obviously I really enjoyed it, but when you're with a bunch of doctors, all we talked about was medicine. When you're with my husband, Marty, he's a businessman, you talk about business. But I felt like when I met and talked to artists, I felt this amazing energy and creativity, and we talked about everything related to culture. So to me, I don't think of it as assembling artists and curators. I feel like this morning, we had friends over, and it's that kind of relationship. It really gave me an escape. So, being a physician can be very stressful. So really, art and having friendships with artists and curators and other collectors was really an escape. It was a way for me to really unwind and just relax. And as I said, over time, it became almost an addiction because my husband and I, we love collecting art. We love going to visit museums and studios. And it's been a great hobby for us to have together. So when we go to, travel in different cities, we always try to meet an artist. Or remember that time, Marty, when we decided we were in Colorado and I had read about an artist, a sculptor who had been an astronaut before. His name was, first name was Dwight, Ed Dwight, thank you. So I just called him up. We were in his home city, and I said, "You don't know me, but," and he invited us over, and it's been amazing. And I feel like we had that experience over and over again.
I think it's very special to kind of build relationships with artists, but even more so when you build relationships with successful artists, which I think something Anita has done with great kind of expertise and aplomb. So to name but a few, obviously there's Dawoud Bey, but we have Amanda Williams, Theaster Gates, Kerry James Marshall, Nate Young, Caroline Kent. This is a certain kind of tier of artists that we're kind of engaging with. And maybe you could just reflect on that. Is that just the virtue of being in Chicago and having access to such talent? Or is there something else that you see in the discourse and the dialogue and their kind of creativity that draws you to them?
Sure. Well, I think I just was lucky, actually, because, I met the artist, loved the work, and that's the thing about Chicago. We are so blessed to have so much talent here. So, yes, you named really some great artists that are very well known. But what I have always liked is finding the artists as they're just developing their careers. There's a woman, a great photographer, her name is Jordan Woodruff, who's in the audience. Amazing talent. Wangari Maathai is in the audience. Wangari is one of the best painters of our time. So, this is a tip I'm giving you. But so for me, it was easy because I saw people, I recognized there was this great talent. And the nice thing about being in Chicago as opposed to New York or LA, artists feel more relaxed about letting you into their spaces. So I feel like it was a great way to get to know them. But we really just bought what we loved. And we've been collecting since I was 25. I'm 59 now. And we haven't sold a single piece of art because, one, we still love it. And two, I'd be embarrassed if someone came into my house and I sold one of their pieces because it feels like one of my children and an extension of a friend, right? So.
That's a great anecdote. Could you talk maybe for these guys, talk about maybe how you met someone like Kerry and got introduced to his practice? Anita always has great stories around how she meets specific artists.
So if anybody knows Kerry, it's very hard to meet him, but I stalked him. So Marty and I met him when he had a show at MCA, and we went up and talked to him, and later they used to have this program called Have a Lunch with an Artist, and I remember calling him or emailing, I don't think there was email back then, but reaching out to him and saying, would you like to have lunch together? And of course, no response, no response. So then I asked Theaster, I go, well, I have this lunch with the artist, would you just go to lunch with us? And then sure enough, Kerry called me, I think like the day before and said, I'll have lunch with you. And it was actually a beautiful friendship, but it's one of those things you have to respect the artist and the space they're in. I remember one time Kerry invited us to come to his studio, which is a rare thing. And I remember telling him, well, Kerry, he said, come to my studio at noon. And I said, well, I'm supposed to be meeting with my boss at noon. And he said, well, you can come at noon. So I called my boss and I was like, I need to meet you at 1:30. So, but I think that's the part of the friendship is a mutual respect and valuing the work that they do.
Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful that you said you have to respect the artist and their space. And I guess with each of them, there's such a kind of bespoke relationship that you develop with them, right? You get to know their personalities, the sort of edges of what is like permissible in terms of your interactions with them, but also maybe how you might support them. Do you think intentionally about how you might support an artist when you develop a relationship with them?
So first, I think making sure that you collect their work and support them when they do make the transition from selling to having representation with galleries, both ways. And then I think supporting their shows. I remember I went to see Dawoud show in Birmingham. I went to see Kerry's show, donating to the museums that are sponsoring the shows. And it doesn't mean you have to give $1 million. Whatever you can giving to the museums to make sure that everyone values their work as you do. So traveling with them, having them over for dinner. If they have a show in town or a place, I'll often have a little dinner to just welcome them and their friends and family too. And just like today, we were in town for Black Trustees Alliance, and there were a number of artists here, and kind of impromptu, I think it was Jordan Castile, Dawoud Bey, Yesomi, they all just came over for breakfast. So sometimes it's just, making some bacon and eggs and saying, come on over. So,
Some really good bacon and eggs, by the way. So one of the images I think that just flashed behind us is an image by David Hart, which is part of his Stray Light kind of project, where he photographed the sort of former officers of the Johnson Publishing Library, Johnson Publishing officers, and that was one of the pieces that you showed me again when I visited your house. Could you talk to me about that work
Sure.
in particular? This is us in Hawaii, by the way.
Yes, it is, actually. And so going back to Kerry again, so David Hart is an amazing photographer who spent some time in Chicago. He actually documented Johnson Publishing Company before they sold and dismantled the building, which was an amazing building. And that's what I love about artists. They really document culture for us in a way, and especially artists who document Black achievement in Chicago has been important to me. So David did a project called Stray Light, in which he documented these amazing spaces in Johnson Publishing. And I get a call from Kerry, and he said, "Have you heard of David Hart?" I go, "No." He said, "Go to his house today and buy one of his photographs." And I said, "Well, Kerry, I don't know him." And he goes, "Well, this is his phone number. And let me tell you, if Kerry James Marshall tells you to do something, you do it." So I call him, "You don't know me, can I come over today?" And the image I bought, Dawoud and I actually had visited the place. We had visited Johnson Publishing Building with Linda, and I loved the trophy room because to me that photograph really represented Black achievement and excellence. So what I also liked, it wasn't just trophies, but it was a picture, a painting of the White House and a painting of this beautiful woman who was in the background of it. And that was the image I decided to buy. Some years later, that image was actually available for purchase, and we had the option, and that's it actually, that image that you see there with the green background. And no one recognized or made the connection that that was the painting. It was painted by, I think, Samuel Conti in 1949. But when I saw it, I immediately said, I have to buy that, because it was the conversation that was happening and the historical significance of not only that artist, but Johnson Publishing and what that meant as far as American culture, innovation, and entrepreneurship. So.
Yeah, so I remember going to Anita's house. She had showed me at a previous visit the David Hart piece, and then I went to her house again, and she said, "I have something to show you." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Well, just go through there, right, and tell me what you see." And so I think I entered sort of the stairway area, and obviously I saw the David Hart piece, and I was looking around trying to really understand where she was directing me to, and then I saw the Conte piece kind of in proximity to it.
Absolutely.
And that's when I knew that Anita had a really, really strong curatorial eye. So she's not just very adept at kind of discovering artists and building relationships with them, but I think she's also really, really kind of has a keen expertise in kind of making connections, narrative connections between artists, especially in her collection. And I think it's one thing to recognize David Hart's project and documenting this history, but it's another thing to actually collect this historical work and bring that into the collection as well. And I think in that way you're kind of recognizing value across decades of artistic practice, but also kind of recognizing this sort of cultural moment through the Johnson Publishing Company that somehow brought these two artists into coincidence, which might not have existed before. So I think that's a beautiful kind of description of your curatorial eye. So this is the piece that was later acquired.
And that's Wangari's piece, who also is in the audience, as I said, amazing painter.
Can you maybe give us some examples about other kind of relationships between artists or kind of practices that you've tried to establish in your collecting? Is that something that you consciously think of, or is it kind of, it comes about through this sort of kind of serendipitous opportunity that we see in the Conte and the David Hart work and that connection between the two of them?
Well, I think what I do is I try to make connections between people, and I have always tried to make sure that I hang around smart people like you and other curators and other collectors, and I want to make sure that other people have the same experiences. So if I know there's an opportunity for younger artists to meet a more established artist, I try to make those connections happen in comfortable spaces. Somi and I are great friends, and I really feel like what we do together just feels natural. It doesn't feel like collecting. It doesn't feel like anything beyond just what friends do together to enjoy each other and activities that you do together. So I feel really fortunate that I'm friends with probably about, I don't know, 70% of the artists in our collection. And when I do buy new pieces, I try to introduce the new artists that I collect to the artists who are more established that I've already brought into our collection.
Super. So I think maybe we can talk about, in the introduction, we talked about kind of Black cultural production in Chicago. And I think you made an early commitment to supporting specifically Black artists. Can you tell us why that was?
Well, I think it's natural. You want to have a familiarity, right? I want to walk into my home and see people who look like me. and one thing I love about my kids, and Roxanne, my middle daughter, is in the audience. I love when my kids are like mini curators, and when their friends are coming over, and they like showing them around. And I remember my oldest son, and he's going to hate me for saying this, but he moved to New York, and he called me and said, Mama, did you know that Kerry James Marshall is in MoMA? And I go, yes, of course. Are you kidding? He's one of the greatest painters of our time. But to my kids, these were just people that they knew and works that they appreciated. So I feel like, I don't know, to ask why do I collect Black art, I mean, why do you do anything? I mean, of course this is what I would collect. It's part of who I am and what I value. So is that the only thing I collect? No, but certainly it's an important and prominent part of what I do because it's part of who I am.
Could you talk about Chicago more specifically?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we've talked about the artists in Chicago and the great talent here, but I'd love to hear about the lineage of collecting here.
Absolutely.
And obviously, we have a great number of
Yes.
amazing supporters of the arts here in Chicago.
Absolutely.
But I, as somebody who relatively new to the city, having spent 5.5 years here, I really want to know where that lineage came from and who you
Absolutely.
looked to. Who was that
Absolutely.
generation that you sort of, try to kind of pick up the baton from and kind of continue that sort of great legacy of arts patronage and collecting in the city?
So remember, I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I was the first physician in my family, and I actually did my residency at University of Chicago. And there was an amazing man, Dr. Jimmy Jones, who was actually, I think, the first Black man who was on the board of MCA, and his wife, Jetta Jones, who was on the board of Art Institute. So Jimmy Jones was an OBGYN, and he would bring his old art magazines and leave them in labor and delivery. So I was in labor and delivery and worked back before the 80-hour work week limitation. So we were there all night and all the next day. So sometimes you get tired of reading medical journals. So I picked up these art magazines and started flipping through them. And when we were doing the C-section one day, I think I asked him, hey, how'd you get into this art? And he gave me a few books. And from there, he helped Marty get on the board of MCA. Jetta, helped me with some cultural organizations. And I mean, there's such a great history, rich history. I mean, I can look out in the audience. There's Milo, there's Eric McKissick, there's Denise Gardner, there's Diane Dinkins Carr. So many amazing collectors. I mean, there's Daryl and Allison. You could replace me with half the people in the room. And I think that's really the richness of Chicago. It's a community, so we're not competing, we're learning from each other, and we're sharing this great art journey with curators, with artists, and with each other.
Yeah, you were speaking about being part of this Black Trustee Alliance group, and I was really astounded by how more than 100 collectors kind of came to the city of Chicago and convened to think about, the sort of community of patronage across the United States, but also how significant I think that convening happened in a city like Chicago, with such a great kind of heritage towards arts collecting. Could you talk about your work with institutions?
Absolutely.
And how through being a trustee or supporter, you're able to kind of support individual artists or groups of artists. I'm just wanting to unpack that a little bit more. There's the kind of difference between, making sure that you're following an artist's work and collecting the work, supporting their exhibitions, and then there's a difference between being part of an institutional kind of structure and trying to shift the dial in terms of where they focus their attentions in terms of collecting. And I would just love to talk about how you might advocate through that means.
So I want to make sure that people can find and experience art where they are. So again, because I didn't have the typical experience, some of the early things I did, I worked in Leadership Advisory Committee, which is a advisory committee to Art Institute. And I actually did public programs, and I worked with Erica Hubbard and also Aaron Gilbert. And we created this program called New Paradigms, where we brought artists to the stage, but we also interacted with them in spaces in the community. One of my favorite activities we did was with Margaret Burroughs, and we had a collaboration between Art Institute and DuSable Museum. So we created this children's coloring book of some of her works. So it was a way of having kids come into Art Institute, doing activities at DuSable Museum, and then doing things out in the community. I remember Theaster Gates, when he had his arts block, we would sometimes do activities with kids in the neighborhood around arts, but right there where they live, because you want people to feel like beautiful things can happen anywhere. You don't have to come downtown. You don't have to come to a museum, even activating your own space. And that was why it was important for me to collect, but also to invite other people in to see the work too.
Super. Maybe we could talk about collecting outside of Chicago and
Sure.
other artistic practices that have drawn your eye. I know recently you traveled to Brazil and got to experience the kind of Afro-Brazilian art practices. Aside from the works that you collected, can you talk about that experience in terms of thinking about Black cultural production, but in a different context, such as Brazil, and the works that you eventually kind of acquired into the collection?
Yes. Well, I think it's important. There's no end to talent in the art spaces, and one thing, traveling with you really helped open my eyes to a lot of artists. I just wish I bought them the minute you told me to. It was Yesomi, and I don't know if you remember, but we went together to Prospect, and you introduced me to Michael Armitage, who I later purchased his work and got to meet through you in London. So I really try to listen to people who know more than I do and learn from them. And I really have to thank you for opening my eyes. When I was thinking about going to Brazil, you encouraged me to go. And I really value the relationship and friendship we've had together, because I feel like you really opened my eyes to looking more internationally and not just in Chicago and in the United States. So thank you. But yes, oh my gosh, I went to Brazil and I lost my mind. It was amazing, because what I didn't realize about Brazil, the connection between Africa and Brazil is so much stronger than even here in the United States. As you know, a large number of enslaved people went to Brazil, and because it was such a big proportion, it has really been accepted and absorbed in the full culture. So I remember going to Brazil and calling Marty and was like, hey, do you think you can give me some money to buy some artwork? Because I was just overwhelmed at the amazing talent that was there. And so it really opened my eyes. I've gone to London and I've traveled around many places. I'm going to Venice tomorrow with Somi and with Marty. And so it really has been quite an adventure. And I retired 2 years ago, and I have to say that it really has become, besides, religion and family, one of my greatest loves is really the exploration and discovery of new artists and new work. And I have to give a shout out to Lisa Stuver, who is my banker. She realizes what a love it is for me, because I'm not calling Marty, I'm calling Lisa. But the thing is, I think the take-home message is you can start collecting wherever you are. And I remember one of the very first pieces I bought is Dalton Brown, who is an artist here in Chicago. And, so it isn't like you have to go and buy the biggest and the most expensive piece ever. I was just very lucky at a time when Theaster was starting his career, Dawoud, Kerry, that we all became friends at a convenient time. But for me, it's about the love of the work and not the rest. So yes, thanks for bringing up Brazil, but I really have you to thank for sending me out there. So.
Could we talk a little bit, now that you've been collecting for many decades, one can say, and I guess maybe at the beginning you were collecting artists that you have relationships with, there's a keen focus on Black cultural production. Have you settled on kind of another area of focus in terms of medium? Is there ways that you're thinking about expanding the collection, or are you still kind of following the same kind of motivations that you were at the beginning? Because I think oftentimes when collectors start collecting, the sort of inspiration might start somewhere, but then the collection takes them somewhere completely different. And I'm just interested in where you are in your collection journey.
Sure. Well, I don't have any checklist, and I don't have like the valuable artists that you must buy. I buy what I feel inspired by. But I think it's natural to start with photography and the figure, because I think that makes most sense and you connect to it most. And I think as I saw more artwork, I branched out more into conceptual art and more into abstract art. And so I think that's a natural progression. Not that I don't value all of it, but you start out in one place and then you expand to collect other things as well. And as I said, being friends with curators and other collectors and artists, I feel like you really build upon what you are exposed to. So you only know what you've seen. So I think that's been an important part of it. But even though I collect a variety of things now, and so I think that the collection is more complex, I still love what I love. So the thing that Betty Saar, the very first piece that we bought when I was 25, I still absolutely love it. And I think I was showing it to someone just today. So.
Any other tips for although these guys in the room are very, very well versed in collecting, but I wondered if you could kind of give any more tips about how to start a collection, how to sustain it, how to build those relationships with artists, for those in the room who might be thinking about starting collecting.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting now, because back in the day when we were collecting, it was kind of like the lonely only. Like there was a small group of collectors and we all knew each other and you all kind of went in the same circles. I think a lot more people are exposed and interested in art, but for different reasons. So I would say don't be transactional about collecting and meeting artists. I would say be more genuine in building relationships, because I think that's going to resonate with artists. And in the long term, I think that will make you have more joy in the objects that you collect. Well, thank you so much. I'm honored and thrilled to see all of you. So thank you for everything. And thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you.